Welcome to another episode of the Everything Antarctica Podcast. I'm Maddie Jordan. I'm here once again with Johnny Harrison, and this week we are talking about fam trips. Fam trips are typically the types of adventures that we get to do on our time off and get to experience all that Antarctica has to offer. This fam trips are called something different depending on what station you're at, but the concept stays the same. It's essentially those moments that we get to get out and experience Antarctica. So Johnny, do you want to tell us about some of the things that we get to do on fam trips?
Fam trip, so as far as I understand it, fam trip is an abbreviation of familiarisation trip. So the idea is that there's a bunch of these different activities that often we do year on year, and as a big group you're able to go off and experience some of these things. So one of the first one that often will come to mind is our trips via Hagland or using Haglands up McMurdo Sound on the frozen sea ice, and going and seeing the historic huts of Shackleton and of Scott. So that's a pretty special and unique trip that we get to do, and we are so fortunate that we get to go and step back into history and see how these huts were left after these explorers carried on their adventures.
Yeah, I'm very fortunate in that the location of Scott Base and McMurdo Station are near to these locations where the early explorers set themselves up as bases for their exploration activities. So this one in the background, this is Shackleton's hut, Nimrod hut out at Cape Roids. It's the furthest hut away from us on Ross Island and is typically the most difficult to get to. For that reason, it's usually only open for a couple of weeks every year, so there's often a desire for people to try and get out there. That will mean that our field staff who run these familiarisation trips will make an extra effort to try and get people out to Cape Roids. The added benefit of Shackleton's hut at Cape Roids is that it's situated right next to an Adelie penguin colony. So for those folks who go down to Antarctica, contrary to what you might think, penguins aren't just running around everywhere, particularly at the inland stations where they'll not see them at all. But for places like Scott Base and McMurdo, it's only a certain period of the year when you start to get the wildlife that far south. So this gives people an opportunity quite early in their deployment, sort of around November, December-ish, to experience and see penguins in their natural habitat.
Yeah, and it's key to note that this ends up being quite a long day, and so Haglands can't move particularly fast on the sea ice generally, and so it ends up being a complete day trip. So the guys will normally get up pretty early, and instead of waiting and lounging around and waiting for that brunch on the Sunday, you get into it pretty promptly, and often there'll be a whole bunch of stuff that'll get mobilised or put together before the day. So usually the night before, a bunch of prep work will go into getting the trip ready to go and get all the stuff into the Haglands that we're going to be taking and all that kind of thing, and then that means that on the Sunday morning we're just ready to kind of hit the ground running. So everyone will meet down in the boot room, down in the locker room at a certain time, and then from there essentially we'll be in the back of the Hagland for a full day out, and that day will typically go past, first of all, around on the ice shelf around the Armitage Loop, and then it will go up north, up McMurdo Sound, and it will go past McMurdo, and then we'll end up getting to Cape Evans.
Yeah, we're fortunate enough to have access to 3 historic huts in the area. So there's Scott's Discovery Hut, which is just out the front of McMurdo Station. You have Scott's Terra Nova Hut at Cape Evans and Shackleton's Nimrod Hut at Cape Roids. So those are the 3 that familiarisation trips are focused on. The hut at Cape Evans is Sir Robert Falcon Scott's hut. This was his second hut after Discovery Hut, and this was the hut where Scott and his men based themselves in their push to be the first to reach the South Pole. For those who are unfamiliar with that story, it ended up being a race between Scott and Amundsen, the Norwegian, and Amundsen actually got to the pole first, so beat Scott there by about 4 or 5 weeks. Scott arrived, saw a Norwegian tent there. Unfortunately, Scott and 4 of his men perished on their way back to Cape Evans. But being able to visit this hut at Cape Evans, which is the biggest of the 3 historic huts in the area, is pretty special walking in there. There's just a vibe in all of these huts that it almost feels like the men had just departed, just left, locked the door up and left everything else behind. There's remnants of socks and clothing and food, and the dining table where they would have shared their meals is still sitting there, still set up with chairs pushed in. The beds are still unmade in some cases. There's photography gear and scientific gear like beakers and other glass jars that are sitting around, and it's quite a moving experience to be able to feel and appreciate what those men must have gone through back in those days.
And it's a living museum, and one of the things is that you feel that at any minute these people could walk through the door returning from a journey or an expedition themselves. So it is quite surreal being in these spaces in the conditions that these people would have actually experienced. So while we're all kitted up in our very nice warm layers of equipment and gear and our new technology, it still ends up giving you a real appreciation for what the living conditions were. And it's just a super it's an absolute privilege and an honour to be able to actually visit these spaces.
Absolutely. One thing to note with these historic huts is they're not exactly as they were left back in the early 1900s. An organisation based in New Zealand called the New Zealand Antarctic Heritage Trust have spent a significant amount of time, talking over decades, preserving many tens of thousands of artefacts, and some of those that you can see on the decal behind us. But everything from, the stove to the old food labels to the cups and the pans and the jugs and the mugs and things, these are all things that have been meticulously restored back to as close to original condition as they can be to prevent further deterioration. These artifacts in many cases have been sitting there for over 100 years. So need a little bit of love and a little bit of care to keep them in tip-top condition for people to actually go back and appreciate.
And as you said sort of before, we've got Shackleton's hut up there at Cape Roids, and that was part of the Nimrod expedition. And as you sort of touched on before, that's where most people will have their first encounter with any real wildlife, any Adelie penguins in particular. So that's a particularly special place. And as we drive from Cape Evans up to Cape Roids, there are a couple of other spots of note that we'll normally stop at. And what are they?
Yeah, well, beyond just the fact that you've got a lot of cracks in the sea ice, and that's a very dynamic place to be. Typically takes quite a long time to get from Cape Evans to Cape Roids, which is probably only about 10 kilometres apart. But there's a typical prominent feature there called the Barn Glacier, and it's quite a prominent glacier that sits out, juts pretty much next to the sea ice, and quite a sheer, towering, straight cliff of ice that often has seals at the bottom of it. So many people who haven't had the opportunity to experience some of the seal life around get to see some of them there, if they haven't already seen them on the journey north already. But that Barn Glacier is quite a prominent feature.
Yeah, that's most people's first interaction with a particularly that close to a full-size glacier, and it, as you say, just it's an impressive in its scale.
Yeah.
The other thing that the other big feature that we drive past, and hopefully if conditions allow we go and explore a little bit, is the Erebus Glacier Tongue, and we've sort of touched on glacier tongues in our ice episode. What's the Glacier Tongue, and what do we do that's unique and special there?
Yeah, the Glacier Tongue is quite a unique feature in that it's essentially a glacier, a piece of ice, but is floating on the ocean. If you look at the Glacier Tongue from above, from the air, like a saw shark that has the nose with little barbs on the side of it, it's pretty similar to what it looks like. But often in the end of the Erebus Glacier Tongue, when we're driving past it, we're on the sea ice, and that often affords us the opportunity to be able to climb into some of the ice caves that have revealed themselves, typically from weathering underneath. So when the sea ice disappears, that ocean is sitting there, and there's just erosion from the wave action and the tides that will chip away at that. As the winter comes along and the sea ice starts to reform, a base will develop there, which gives us the opportunity to enter into these hollow areas and have a look around. They're often filled with icicles and other really cool ice features, and it's a pretty special experience to be inside one of those.
Yeah, absolutely. And then so that kind of touches on all of those kind of trips. So often, if we're lucky, there might be 3 or 4 of those happening sort of weekend after weekend for a few weeks. And then after that's done, then and the sea ice conditions deteriorate, we can no longer actually do those trips. And then focus then starts to turn to other other adventure opportunities around Ross Island. So kind of, I guess, one of the other ones to touch on is Discovery Hut.
Yeah, Discovery Hut is accessible all the time, and it's definitely the most visited of the historic huts in the area, just given its location. It's less than a kilometre away from McMurdo Station. People often find themselves down at Hut Point, which is the location where the hut is, and it's a nice place just to go and hang out and get nice views and have a look at what's going on the sea ice, or when the sea ice breaks out, what's happening in the ocean. Discovery Hut was the first hut built on Ross Island. It was part of Scott's expedition in 1902, part of Scott's expedition between 1901 and 1904, and that is an expedition that can be done just after dinner time. So someone might just put a note on the board to say, hey, we're going to do a quick fam trip out to Discovery Hut, and then you might get 8 people or so that will head out there, get a guided tour through the hut to have a look at some of the features there. One of the things to note with these huts is they are designated as Antarctic Specially Protected Areas, which is the highest designation for a landmark or a natural feature under the Antarctic Treaty System. So everyone who goes to visit these has a very strict set of guidelines that they need to abide by. One of those criteria is that you need to be guided through the hut by a trained hut guide. That person is responsible for preserving the hut and making sure that the criteria for entry are being satisfied. So that could be something like, no food, no drink, no smoking in the hut, or no open flames in the hut, no pointy legs on the bottom of your tripods, not touching any of the artifacts. It could be something like one of the other really important things is cleaning your shoes, making sure that all of the rocks and things are outside it so we're not denting the wooden floorboards. So lots of criteria, and that hut guide will be the person who ensures that all of those things are being satisfied.
And the hut guides often also have some good information around some of the history of the huts as well, which is really cool. So it kind of gives you that sort of picture as you're, preparing to go into this place. They're kind of saying, right, well, this was this person's hut and this is what happened here, and, all the kind of give you some of that backstory and that history. So when you step in, you've kind of actually, it just there's a bit more weight when you actually move into these places, which is really cool.
Yeah, and when we say hut guides, we don't mean that there's a specialised person who's just there to do that. Often it will be filled by someone else who's got a special interest in those areas. So I'm a trained hut guide. I love going into the huts, and I love taking people in there for their first time to sense their reactions, because for me it takes me back to the first time I walked in there and gives me that appreciation again of just how special that place is. Not that it ever wears off, I don't think it ever will, but it's so satisfying and brings me so much joy to see someone experiencing that for the first time as they're walking through.
Great. Another fam trip that we get to go on, which is a little bit more abstract. Some years ago, many years ago, there was a plane accident. There's been many plane accidents down in Antarctica. This one particular one resulted in a Constellation, which is a type of plane, crash landing at one of the airfields, and the wreckage of that plane never got salvaged, and so the tail section of that plane is still visible to this day. And so one of our fam trips that we get to do is actually go out for a bit of an explore and drive out onto the ice shelf past the new runway and the new airfield, and carry on round out to the wreck of the Pegasus.
Yeah, that's a really interesting experience, and that for many people is often their first experience on the ice shelf. After having landed there, you don't actually get to spend much time when you fly in, but that for many people gives them a real sense of just how remote you are, because you're in the middle of the ice shelf, or part of the ice shelf, and it's quite a way back to base. The nearest airfield's a few kilometres away, and you really get this sense of isolation. But then there's just a plane sitting there that is progressively being buried, and every year someone goes out and tries to dig it out a little bit more, but it's pretty futile. And yeah, just a really interesting experience to go and have a look at that plane that has unfortunately just sat there for many years.
it's one of those things you touch on around. It's the first time that you really get to go out to the ice shelf after getting down in the first place, and when you first land in Antarctica, you're sort of taken aback and in awe of where you are. So you don't really have the time to fully understand what it is that you're seeing, and so some weeks, months later, when you actually go out to see the Pegasus wreck, it's quite special in the sense that you get a better understanding and a better appreciation of where you've actually flown into as well. So it kind of helps kind of go full circle almost, and kind of really kind of give you that rounding out of that picture of where it is that you actually are.
Yeah, one other interesting part of that in terms of fam trip perspective is that's a great location to watch the last sunset and the first sunrise. So leading into winter and then coming out of winter, leading into the summertime. Where Scott Base and McMurdo are, our view to the north, where the sun sets and rises on those days, is obstructed by a hill. So to actually be able to see the sun dip below the horizon and rise above the horizon, that location there gives you a great view towards the north of looking up McMurdo Sound, and that is often an experience that is catered just for those winter folks that are there in the period of sort of mid to late April and mid to late August.
Yeah, and I always tried to make sure that if we tried to break the crew up into two. So for that winter crew, we tried to make it so that everyone could either go out for the last sunset or for the first sunrise, so that you got one of those two fam trips in your winter, because it is such a poignant moment in your season, and it is such a transition from, okay, we've now hit this milestone moment, and now the season really changes.
Yeah, absolutely. Beyond the ice shelf, when we start getting into fam trips on the land, so there are a number of other opportunities. One of the ones that sticks out for me is being able to abseil into a crevasse. So below or near our ski field, there's a crevasse there that we aptly name the ski field Crevasse, and there's often an opportunity to go abseiling or spelunking or rappelling down into the bottom of that crevasse. It's probably about 10 or 15 metres deep and probably only about 1 or 2 metres wide, but continues on for quite some time. So getting to the bottom of that, being able to stand in it and look at what a crevasse actually looks like, which you can't really see from the surface, is quite an eye-opening experience. It's not something that you just walk along and go, oh yeah, there's a crevasse over there, but when you're in the bottom of it, it gives you a new appreciation for the risk of, for the dynamics and the way that these things change and how crevasses are created and how they move around. So getting to the bottom of a crevasse and being able to look up at the surface and see the sky gives you a real appreciation for what a crevasse is.
Yeah, and there used to be one that's was open for a long time, and I think it's just opened up again, and it was affectionately known as the IMAX crevasse because some decades ago they filmed an IMAX movie down there, and this particular crevasse is quite large, and I think that you could actually walk in at the bottom of the crevasse, which is pretty cool. So it meant that you could actually take groups of people in at the same time rather than abseiling, sort of rappelling down one at a time with somebody else. Yeah.
So I mean, that really speaks to my nature of things that I enjoy doing. Like, I like rock climbing and I like being out in the mountains and the hills and things like that. So that for me is a pretty special one, and is one of those experiences that you really don't get to do many other places on the planet. So that sticks with people as well.
Yeah, another one that we get to do, we're pretty fortunate in the sense that down there we have snowmobiles, and so certain times of the year we'll actually run snowmobile fam trips, and so particularly in the southern hemisphere there's not many places that you get to have a go on a snowmobile, and so that's a real cool way to go out in a convoy, and you might take about 15 or 20 of them out at a time, and there's a few different places we can go, and one of the places is called Room with a View, and that's sort of that's probably maybe in 45 minutes, an hour's drive away on a skidoo, and so it kind of gets you up onto one of the flanks of Mount Erebus, and you sort of get just a bit closer to Mount Erebus, which is really cool. And you get a bit of elevation as well, which again, when you're sort of taking in these giant vistas, it's really nice to be able to see a different perspective on things, and also get to go around on a skidoo, which is just a whole lot of fun.
Yeah, I've never done the snowmobiling part of that, but I've been up to Room with a View a number of times, and one of my favourite things to do in the winter was to go out to Room with a View when there was a good aurora forecast. You get so far away from any type of light pollution that it's just so dark, and to see the aurora sort of light up in that location is a pretty special experience. And in the summertime provides amazing views of Mount Erebus, and you can also see towards the north looking up McMurdo Sound, and then the mountain ranges and the islands down to the south as well.
So not typically called a fam trip, but also something that we have the luxury of being able to do is climbing up one of the local features called Castle Rock. Do you want to give us a bit of an overview of what Castle Rock is?
Yeah, so every time I've done that, it has been as part of an arranged fam trip, as something to do on a Sunday to get people out of the house or off base. And as the sea ice starts to close and the focus shifts to doing some of those fam trips on land, our field team, who are trained in things like mountaineering and crevasse rescue and working on glaciers and things like that, will go up and they'll set up a fixed line, which is essentially just a safety feature that we'll have. So when we go up there, we'll be wearing a harness with 2 cow's tails, 2 carabiners on the edge of a lanyard, and we'll clip into the rope with both of those. As we come to a section where there's a bolt, we'll unclip, move ourselves across, and then that will be our safety feature to get to the top of this rock. It's not a massively strenuous climb. I don't think it goes for a massive period of time. You might be able to get from the bottom to the top in about 20-30 minutes ish, but when you get to the top, again, just amazing views in all sorts of directions, panoramic for 360 degrees, and great views of Mount Erebus, amazing views back down towards Scott Base and McMurdo. You can see some of the prominent features around there like Ob Hill and Crater Hill, and it's also just nice to get out onto the peninsula there, which is, yeah, it's quite a special place to go.
So these are most of the fam trips that we would get to enjoy during a season down in Antarctica as base staff. So there are a whole bunch of other things that just fall under general outdoor recreation, and we've done a whole episode on that which you can follow up on. But that kind of concludes the bulk of the fam trips or the familiarisation trips that we have, that are generally larger trips that consist of having usually a guide or somebody else that's kind of managing them, and then a larger group of participants partaking in those trips. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you've got any other questions or any comments around familiarisation trips, or if you are based at another station or have been based at another station, we'd love to know what it is that you guys have done as part of your fam trips. We're always keen to learn more about the things, so flick us a comment in the section below, and we look forward to hearing from you.
That's it for today's episode of the Everything Antarctica podcast. Thanks for listening. If you want to find out more about us as hosts, you can find us on Instagram at Matty K. Jordan and at Johnny Harrison NZ. We're also on socials. You can find us at Everything Antarctica. This episode will be released on all streaming platforms, and the long form video will be found on YouTube. Check us out wherever you listen to your podcasts.
If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a 5-star rating. This will really help us in our mission to make this podcast as good as it possibly can be. Please share this episode with your friends and social networks so we can spread the word to more people.
Until next time, stay cool.